Good evening. Welcome to the Rainier Extreme Screen. I'm George Guastello. I'm President and CEO of Union Station, and we'd like to welcome you to this very special evening organized by our good partners, the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. This speaker series is an undertaking that has proven to be quite successful to extend the value of our exhibition, Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, but allows us to continue the march to ensure that the mission of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education comes to fruition and continues to support their amazing mission. I'd like to thank you for your interest and especially in this evening's topics, and we hope you will all join us again and again and tell your friends and family to join us. For those of you that are online right now, this gives you an opportunity to have a deeper appreciation for the Holocaust and ensuring that it never happens again and that it is long ago and far away. Today we stand today with our exhibition. Over 260,000 people have come from over 50 states to see this exhibition, to be educated, motivated, and satisfied. It's hard for us to believe that the entire community is embracing this topic, especially in light of diversity, inclusion, and equity, because Auschwitz is the perfect example of what happens when you do not have diversity, inclusion, and equity in your world. And even more important, over 20,000 students have already experienced this exhibition for free, thanks to great sponsors that we've had. And these are the impressions and experiences that will last a lifetime, that will help ensure evil will not find fertile ground in our world and in our future. This is a very important week. Little did I know when we worked on this to create this exhibition, to bring it here nearly 5 years ago, Jessica, that we would be here today in one of the most important weeks of our history to be able to tell the story of Auschwitz and the Holocaust at the historic Union Station. Let me just tell you a couple of things that are happening, and many of you know. This is the commemoration of Kristallnacht, which happened on November 9th, 1938, a violent anti-Jewish demonstration that broke out across Germany and beyond. And of course, second, on November the 11th, is the celebration of the National Independence Day in Poland, making the anniversary of the restoration of Poland sovereignty in 1918 from Germany, Hungary, and the Russian empires. And of course, Veterans Day, this November 11th. So this is a historic week for us to be able to tell this story to our community and most importantly from around the world. And there are many other exciting announcements that will happen coming this week. I can't tell you right now, but watch, especially on Friday, the 12th, after all these things. Historic, needless to say, so be watching. And if you have, how many of you have seen the exhibition? Bless you all. How many of you haven't? Okay, everybody, let's go after them right now and encourage them. What are you waiting for? We look forward to seeing you at the exhibition. I recently got an email. I'm off script, Michael, just for a second. I just recently got an email from an individual that sent it to us via social media that said they were stuck at our airport, and I thought we were going to hear a really bad story about our horrific airport. But they got stuck at the airport, their plane was canceled, and we advertised at the airport. They saw the advertisement for Auschwitz, and they came to the exhibition. They wrote the story, and they said this was the most important and moving exhibition that they have ever experienced in their life, that they had been to Washington, and they had been to other national monuments. And they thanked us, and they said that they hope that their community, LA, would have this exhibition in their town. So I think that's a great statement. Bad airport, great exhibition, a great happy customer. We won't have that bad airport for a long while. Now, I've had the great opportunity to be in this woman's presence, to be educated and knowledged and motivated by what she does. Dr. Shelley Klein is the Director of Education and Historian for the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. If you ever have the opportunity to listen and learn from her, you'll be a very lucky human being. I learned a lot recently about the art in this exhibition, but it's my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Klein to you, my friend and a great educator. Dr. Klein?
Thank you, George, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to the entire Union Station team for this incredible partnership that has really allowed us to bring some of the most interesting and exciting voices in Holocaust scholarship to the Kansas City community, and we're very grateful for that. Thank you to Kurt Graham and the Truman Library and Museum for co-sponsoring this event tonight. They are one of our oldest and most important partners in the community, and it's always wonderful to partner with them. We are here tonight to commemorate Kristallnacht, and as George mentioned, it was on this night, November 9th in 1938, that across Germany and German-held territory, a violent pogrom it broke out. It was very well coordinated by the state. The windows of Jewish businesses were smashed, homes were burned and ransacked, synagogues were set on fire. And it was very clear at this moment that normal Jewish life would no longer be possible in Germany after this. But long before this incident of physical violence, Nazis were using the legal system of Germany to persecute its Jewish community. Beginning as early as April 1933, they began to pass laws that made it a little bit harder for Jews to be Jews and a little bit harder for Jews to be German. This culminated in the Nuremberg laws in 1935, which amended the German constitution to write in racial discrimination, including having Jewish citizens lose their citizenships, and they were now considered state subjects. One thing we have to keep in mind is many of the crimes committed during the Third Reich were in fact legal by their own standards. And this is something that, of course, has to be dealt with in the post-war world. And so our speaker tonight will help us understand the many iterations and phases of post-war justice, beginning with the initial period after the war, and then, of course, continuing into our own time. Lawrence Douglas, as you can see, is the Grossfield Professor of Law and Jurisprudence and Social Thought at Amherst College. He is the author of many books, including this one here, The Wrong, Right Man, John Demyanjuk Trial, the last great Nazi war crimes trials. And he is the recipient of many awards and fellowships, both internationally and nationally. So it is my great honor to introduce to you Professor Lawrence Douglas.
So just right at the outset, I want to thank Shelley and Jessica for the incredibly kind invitation. I want to thank the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education and also Union Station, and of course the Truman Museum as well, Truman Library and Museum, for making possible this talk tonight. In this talk, I want to start with a story about memory. And this comes from the mid-70s in Hamburg, Germany. And at the time, German prosecutors conducted a trial of a number of SS officials who had run a camp called Czerniki. The Czerniki camp had been an SS facility located near Lublin in Poland. And during the Holocaust, the SS had recruited about 5,000 Eastern European men, mostly Ukrainians, who had first been taken as POWs by the Germans. And they took these Eastern Europeans, almost all or predominantly Ukrainians, and they trained them to be death camp guards. And a famous alumnus of this Czerniki training facility was John Demjanjuk, about whom you'll hear more in just a bit. So in 1975, German prosecutors tried a handful of SS men who had run the Czerniki training camp. The trial, as I mentioned, was held in Hamburg, and a Jewish survivor of the camp, who had since immigrated to the United States, she returned to Germany to testify. And this survivor recalled that one of the worst SS men that she had encountered at Czerniki had been an Obersturmbannführer named Klink. Okay, and we want this to move forward. Yes. So an Obersturmbannführer named Klink. The only problem was that prosecutors had never encountered the record of an SS lieutenant colonel named Klink at Trinity. And they were actually perplexed by the odd name, because it sounds like a German name, but it actually isn't. And it soon came out that this survivor, who had testified at the trial, had apparently confused her Trinity tormentor with another man. Now, those of a certain age will of course recognize this man as the bungling, monocled colonel who presided over the fictitious Stalag 13 in the American sitcom Hogan's Heroes. In the survivor's mind, Colonel Klink of TV became the lieutenant colonel of Trinity, and the two, she insisted, had looked a great deal alike. Now, I begin with this story because, far from idiosyncratic, I believe it signals the central question that trials of the Holocaust had to face. And that question was, what role should survivor testimony play in such cases? Many of you will recognize this photograph taken from the Nuremberg trial. It shows the 21 leading functionaries of the Nazi state and military who stood trial before the International Military Tribunal. And we don't need to identify them all, but if this pointer works, is that little red dot? I mean, there's Hermann Goering, who at one point was the number 3 in command. Next to him is sitting Rudolf Hess. This is Joachim Ribbentrop, who was the foreign minister. These are leading functionaries of the Nazi state and military who were on trial at Nuremberg. And Nuremberg, we might recall, is the very first international criminal trial in human history. And what made it international was it was a collaborative effort in which the United States, the Soviet Union, the French, and the English together worked to prosecute these leading functionaries of the Nazi state. The Nuremberg trial was not, however, in the first instance, a trial about the Holocaust. The main charge against the 21 Nazi war criminals who were physically in the dock, the main charge was that they had committed crimes against peace. That is, that they had launched a war of aggression in violation of international law. And you might ask yourself, well, why was crimes against the peace the center of the prosecution's case and not, let's say, the crimes of the Holocaust? And I think there are basically two reasons for that. This afternoon, actually this morning, I had the opportunity to visit the fantastic World War I memorial and museum here in Kansas City. And emerging from World War I and going to World War II, there was a pretty widespread perception among international jurists that the key problem in international relations was war itself. And so one of the things that the prosecution tried to do at Nuremberg was to establish a critical precedent that war is the chief offense, is the chief crime against the international order. And the argument was that if you don't have war, then you don't have all these what were considered ancillary offenses that were perpetrated consequent to war, namely war crimes and the crimes against the Jewish population of Europe. So even though the crimes of the Holocaust were again not the centerpiece of the prosecution, Nuremberg conferred judicial recognition on crimes against humanity. And this was the term that was really pioneered and introduced at Nuremberg to describe state-sponsored atrocities. And it was this new legal category, again, crimes against humanity, that enabled prosecutors to do really a pretty impressive job of documenting the Nazis' extermination of the Jews. However, that said, the prosecution's treatment of the subject did suffer from serious shortcomings, which had less to do with what the prosecution said about extermination than how it went about saying it. This picture is also from Nuremberg, and it's certainly far less famous than our previous image, but in its own way, it's even more revealing. To prove the guilt of the accused, Nuremberg prosecutors chose to largely avoid relying on eyewitnesses to Nazi atrocity. Prosecutors worried that Nazi crimes were so extreme, were so astonishing, that survivor testimony would be dismissed as exaggerated or perhaps even as fabricated. And so instead, prosecutors structured their case around captured Nazi documents. And these captured documents were considered harder, more reliable, less vulnerable to cross-examination than eyewitness testimony. And as a result of that, Nuremberg turned into what I'll call a trial by document. That is, a case that was largely absent the lived memory of eyewitnesses. And this photo shows the sea of documents the Allies had to wade through in preparing their case. And on a deeper level, it captures the very nature of the Allied prosecution, which sought to condemn the Nazis with documents of their own making. However, the photo also hints at an unfortunate consequence, an unfortunate inadvertent consequence of this trial by document. The prominent English novelist and journalist, Dame Rebecca West, who at the time was writing for the Daily Telegraph in Britain, she attended the Nuremberg trial. And West memorably described Nuremberg as, quote, a citadel of boredom. And this was not just run-of-the-mill boredom, West wrote. This was boredom on a grand historical scale. Now, this might seem deeply paradoxical. I mean, after all, this is the first international criminal trial in human history. It's a trial with notorious defendants and with spectacular allegations, and yet it proved colossally boring. And yet, I think we can say that the dullness was a direct consequence of what we see in this image of the trial by document, as most of the court's time became devoted to prosecutors simply reading aloud thousands of documents into the official record. And in fact, worse yet, these documents had to be read slowly, painfully slowly, in order to let the simultaneous interpreters who were using a device that had been developed by IBM to give them the opportunity to translate whatever documents they were reading into French, into Russian, sometimes into German as well. Our next image comes from the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961. And see if I can get my red dot. There you can see Eichmann standing attentively in his glass cage. And there we have the three Israeli judges who presided over the case. As a lieutenant colonel in the SS, Eichmann had served as the logistical mastermind of the deportation of Jews to SS killing centers. After the war, Eichmann fled to Argentina, but was captured by agents of Mossad, and he was brought back to Israel to stand trial. This photo of Eichmann seated in his glass booth is probably one of the most famous images that are associated with Holocaust trials. The Israelis actually constructed the glass booth as a security protection for Eichmann to protect him from possible assassination attempts. But the photo projects something, I think, altogether different. It's as if the glass booth was designed not to protect Eichmann from the trial spectators, but the other way around. It looks like a shield designed to protect the courtroom from the accused. The glass booth, in a sense, it transformed Eichmann into a specimen to be studied, to be observed, like a creature almost from a radically different moral universe. And indeed, what emerged from the trial was that far from a sociopath, Eichmann was, if anything, in the words of the Israeli psychiatrist who interviewed him, he was terrifyingly normal. More normal than I am after speaking to him, the psychiatrist said. And so Eichmann famously became the exemplar of what the great political and legal thinker Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. That is, this was a man who saw the performance of his job as his highest ethical duty, even when that job required the performance of morally heinous acts. Now here's a second image from another image from the Eichmann trial. This one requires a little explaining. The Eichmann prosecutors were determined not to repeat the errors associated with Nuremberg's documentary approach. To this end, the Eichmann prosecution consciously organized its case around the testimony of Holocaust survivors. And by telling Holocaust history through the lived memory of survivor witnesses, Israeli Attorney General and Chief Prosecutor Gideon Hausner sought to make the trial into what he called a gripping living record of the Holocaust. And this testimonial approach of Hausner's succeeded in a manner that frankly astonished him and other Israeli officials, because the Eichmann trial became not simply a kind of drama that riveted the Israeli public, it also attracted huge international audience, particularly in the United States and in West Germany. The great Dutch writer Harry Mulisch, he attended the trial, and he described the power of telling Holocaust history through survivor testimony. And this is a quote from Mulisch. As the witnesses spoke about events from their past, this history became real to those who listened. And that, I think, is exactly what we see here. The past made present. The power of the memories of the unseen witness who's testifying. We see the power of that unseen testimony etched, registering on the face of a spectator at the trial. The Eichmann trial, then, it dramatically showcased the power of organizing a Holocaust trial around the lived memory of survivors. But the dangers of basing a trial on survivor testimony were exposed in the other great Holocaust trial that was staged in Israel. And this was the trial of John Ivan Demjanjuk that began in Jerusalem in 1987, roughly a quarter century after Eichmann had been convicted and executed. Demjanjuk, as some of you might recall, Demjanjuk was a native Ukrainian. After the war, he immigrated to the United States and became a naturalized U.S. citizen. He settled in suburban Cleveland, went to work as a machinist at Ford, and life in America was good to Demjanjuk until about the mid-1970s. And that was when American investigators came to identify Demjanjuk as a former death camp guard, and not just any guard. Demjanjuk was alleged to have been Ivan Grozny, or Ivan the Terrible, of the Treblinka killing center, a guard notorious for his sociopathic cruelty. Now, for technical jurisdictional reasons, American prosecutors couldn't try Demjanjuk domestically for crimes that, after all, were committed in another continent against non-US citizens, against Jews in Europe. But what American prosecutors could do is they could charge Demjanjuk with lying on his citizenship application, strip him of his citizenship, and then send him to a country that could try him. And so after a rather long and drawn-out legal process, Demjanjuk was denaturalized, and he was extradited from the United States to Israel. And there, beginning in 1987, Demjanjuk stood trial as Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka. And like the Eichmann trial, the Demjanjuk trial was based on survivor testimony. Indeed, the prosecution's case against Demjanjuk was based almost exclusively on the eyewitness testimony of several Treblinka survivors. And these survivors all swore in court with absolute certainty that Demjanjuk was none other than Ivan the Terrible, their former guard. This is the most famous photo associated with Demjanjuk's Israeli trial. It captures the dramatic moment when Treblinka survivor Eliyahu Rosenberg, and this is Rosenberg over here, when Eliyahu Rosenberg identified the defendant. Rosenberg was testifying. He was asked by the prosecutor if he could positively recognize, positively identify the defendant, and Rosenberg said, "I should like to see him with my own eyes." And so in order to inspect more closely, Rosenberg actually rose from the place where he was giving his testimony and approached the defendant directly, as we see here. And then he said, this is a quote from Rosenberg, "I say unhesitatingly and without the slightest doubt, this is Ivan from the gas chambers. I saw his eyes. I saw those murderous eyes." After 18 months of trial, Demjanjuk was convicted and he was sentenced to death. And if he had been executed, he would have joined Eichmann as the only persons to be executed in Israeli history. Yet in cases of, in capital cases in Israel, the appellate process is mandatory. And so while Demjanjuk's conviction was on appeal, it became clear that Eliyahu Rosenberg and the other survivors of Treblinka had identified the wrong man. Ivan the Terrible, it turned out, had been one Ivan Marchenko, another Ukrainian who bore a small but not entirely negligible similarity to Demjanjuk. And apparently this Marchenko had not survived the war. As far as anyone was able to tell, he had died fighting with partisans in the Balkans towards the end of the war. The photo then that we see here of Rosenberg peering into Demjanjuk's murderous eyes suddenly, as a result of this new information, took on a very different meaning from when it was first circulated. At the time, it was meant to be an image of the power of indelible memory to serve as a means of legal reckoning. But now, sadly, it stands as an emblem of the slippages of memory and the undependability of eyewitness testimony, even of the most extreme traumas. Now, what made everything particularly bizarre in this case is that the evidence that cleared Demjanjuk of being Treblinka's Ivan the Terrible was not entirely exculpatory. That is, it wasn't entirely indicative of Demjanjuk's innocence. In fact, this evidence showed that Demjanjuk had served as a death camp guard, only at Sobibor, a smaller killing center, not Treblinka. Now this created a huge conundrum, because the Israelis had tried Demjanjuk as Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka, not as Ivan the Not-So-Hot of Sobibor. And so in 1993, in a brave and a necessary step, the Israeli Supreme Court threw out Demjanjuk's conviction. And again, this becomes an incredibly long, drawn-out legal process. in which Demjanjuk returns to the United States. Again, for complicated reasons, he actually has his American citizenship temporarily reinstated. This then led to another long drawn-out denaturalization proceeding, now based on the Sobibor evidence. And this earned Demjanjuk the dubious distinction of being the only person in American history to be stripped of his citizenship not once, but twice. And after yet more delay, Demjanjuk was finally deported from the United States to Germany. And there in Munich, beginning in November 2009, he was tried again, this time for his service at Sobibor. And he was convicted in 2011, and he died soon thereafter in 2012. Even though I'm a professor, I got to play a journalist for a while. I had an assignment for Harper's Magazine to cover Demjanjuk's trial in Munich. And this is a photo that was taken on the very first day of Demjanjuk's Munich trial, again in 2009. And what we see here is the 89-year-old defendant lying flat on his back. In fact, he seems to be dead. The photo seems to tell a very disturbing story. Germany has put a corpse on trial. Now, the fact is that the photo was carefully staged by the defense. The defense sought to attack the legitimacy of the trial by presenting Demjanjuk as a frail, sickly scapegoat. Prosecutors immediately asked the court whether there was really any medical reason for Demjanjuk's corpse-like display. And this turned into an early and very strange, vehement argument between the defense and the prosecution, and it resulted in something of a Solomonic compromise. Demjanjuk would be allowed to remain on a hospital gurney, but he would be propped up at a 45-degree angle. Now, I think what this photo also reminds us of is that in today's media-saturated world, these high-profile criminal trials, they inevitably become competitions over images. And these images, as much as anything that actually happens in the courtroom itself, will define the terms of collective memory of the trial. This is a photo taken towards the end of Demjanjuk's Munich trial. That is shortly before his conviction in May of 2011. And he was convicted of being an accessory to the murder of 28,000 Jews. And this was during his service as a guard at the Sobibor Killing Center. And this presents us with a very, very different image of the defendant. So gone is the corpse on trial from the first day of the trial, and now we see a far more characteristic expression. Detached, emotionless, I think it's fair to say even vaguely defiant. And it delivers a powerful, emblematic image, I think, of the remorseless, unapologetic collaborator in Nazi extermination. Now, the fact that Demjanjuk was convicted as an accessory to murder, this requires some comment. The crimes of the Holocaust gave rise to two novel incriminations in international law. And by incriminations, I mean categories of legal wrongdoing. And these two categories are crimes against humanity on the one hand and genocide on the other. And I've already mentioned that crimes against humanity were first successfully prosecuted at Nuremberg. And genocide is the term that was coined in 1944 by Raphael Lemkin. Lemkin was a Polish-Jewish jurist, a refugee who at the time was working as an advisor to the U.S. War Department. And he coined the term in order to distinguish it actually from crimes against humanity, from the emerging definition of crimes against humanity. So crimes against humanity was meant to denote a systematic attack on a civilian population. and genocide in distinction was meant to denote the attempt to destroy an entire group qua group, that is, as a group. Now, genocide, having just been coined in 1944, was not part of the charging sheet at Nuremberg, but genocide became recognized as its own separate crime in international law in 1948 with the framing of the UN Genocide Convention. And these two legal innovations, crimes against humanity on one hand, genocide on the other, they've supplied the basis for charging, they've supplied the basis for the prosecution in bringing charges in many successful Holocaust trials, including, for example, some of you might be familiar with the French trial of Klaus Barbie, the so-called Butcher of Lyon, and also they supplied the basis of the charges brought against Eichmann in Jerusalem. However, Germany, and by Germany I'm referring to the Federal Republic, which at the time we can call West Germany, Germany insisted that because crimes against humanity was only really recognized in international law at Nuremberg in 1945, and the genocide was only recognized as a crime in 1948, Germany argued that using these incriminations to charge former perpetrators and collaborators would be a violation of their new constitution, because it would be a violation of the bar against retroactivity. That is the thing that in American jurisprudence we refer to as ex post facto law. And I'm not going to go into detail about how German courts arrived at this very, very problematic conclusion. Perhaps it's sufficient to say that no other European nation agreed with Germany in that conclusion. And but what it meant was, as a practical matter, the very charging instruments, crimes against humanity, genocide, the very charging instruments designed for prosecuting Nazi exterminators were off the table for German prosecutors. Instead, German prosecutors used the ordinary German murder statute as the basis for all Holocaust trials before German courts. Now, the need to pigeonhole Nazi mass atrocity into the German law of ordinary statutory murder created gross complications for prosecutors. For those inclined to a little bit of cynicism, we might even say that was the point. One of the complications arose from the fact that this German law of murder, held that in order to convict a former SS man as a perpetrator or even as an accessory to murder, the state had to prove that the SS man had killed with his own hands, Now, if you think about it, in cases in which a individual act of hands-on killing, if you could not prove a case of hands-on killing, successful prosecution was basically impossible. And needless to say, the very efficiency of the SS killing operations guaranteed that there were A, very few survivors, and B, very, very few survivors who would be able to identify a specific SS man who engaged in a specific act of hands-on killing. And so this statutory obstacle essentially made post-war prosecutions of thousands of guards basically impossible. Demjanjuk's Munich trial marked a historic, though I think we can all agree, very belated break with this case law. The prosecution in Munich faced the same problem that had disabled thousands and thousands of earlier German cases. The prosecution had irrefutable proof that Demjanjuk had served as a guard at Sobibor. That was not in doubt. But it had no evidence whatsoever, none, that Demjanjuk had killed with his own hand. But the prosecution got around what had been a formidable obstacle to prosecute in these earlier cases by developing a pretty brilliant theory that bypassed the memory of survivors entirely and instead turned on the testimony of professional historians. There you go. The argument had the simplicity of a logical proof, and the argument went like this. All Sobibor guards participated in the killing process. Demjanjuk was a Sobibor guard, therefore Demjanjuk participated in the killing process. Now, the beauty of the argument lay in its insistence that the court could convict Demjanjuk as an accessory to murder in the absence of any direct evidence that he had killed with his own hands. So let's just kind of unpack that a little bit more. So the first premise, that Demjanjuk had served as a Sobibor guard. That, as I've said, was solidly established by document. So that was beyond doubt. The second premise, that all Sobibor guards participated in the killing process. Now that may sound, again, pretty straightforward, but actually it's a pretty complicated historical claim that can only be proven with a pretty comprehensive historical understanding of how a camp like Sobibor operated and what the guards at the camp did. And so what the Munich trial did is it turned into a trial by professional historians. And these historians, they were called as experts, and they established two critical facts. The first was that Sobibor was a death camp, that is an SS killing center. Now again, this might not seem like headline news, but in a moment I think we'll see its relevance and importance. As a second matter, historians testify that all the guards at Sobibor had been generalists. Now Sobibor was a small camp, it was really a tiny camp. The entire supervisory force consisted of only about 15 to 20 SS men and about 100 to 120 of these Triniki trained guards like Demjanjuk. And as a small kind of bare bones operation, all the guards were mobilized when trainloads of Jews arrived. Some of these guards might have manned the guard tower, while others manned the train ramp and ran the well-rehearsed process of destruction. And they circled through these tasks. This historical testimony was essential. It was really crucial, because any suggestion that some guards worked, for example, exclusively as cooks or exclusively as doing the laundry, that might have fatally weakened the prosecution's argument, because again, the indictment turned not on the evidence of what Demjanjuk personally did, but on the function he must have performed given his role as a guard. And from here, the historians drew an interesting comparison with Auschwitz, the subject of the fantastic display that we have here. Now, Auschwitz, for those of you who have visited the exhibition, you know that Auschwitz was a hybrid facility. It was part killing center and part slave labor camp. And about 1.2 million persons were sent to Auschwitz, and about 100,000 survived. Now, if you think about Auschwitz, we're all used to now thinking about rates of lethality as a result of the pandemic that we've been living through. But if you think about 100,000 survivors out of 1.2 million, you're talking about an astonishing lethal place, with over a 90% death rate. But compare that with the approximately 1.7 million Jews who were sent to the extermination facilities of Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor, which were basically pure killing centers. Of that 1.7 million Jews sent to those three camps, about 125 human beings survived. 125. In the case of Auschwitz, it was at least possible that some of the 6,000 guards there had not directly participated in the exterminatory process. In the case of Sobibor, the prosecution argued that was impossible. Sobibor had one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to murder Jews. So by establishing that Sobibor was a killing factory, and that all the guards participated in the killing process, whether or not they killed Jews with their own hands, the court was able to conclude that Demjanjuk must have participated in the killing process, that is, that he necessarily was an accessory to murder. And so the Munich court convicted Demjanjuk and sentenced him to 5 years in prison. And that prison sentence was suspended pending appeal, and he died in a nursing home, as I mentioned, about a year after that conviction. And his conviction, I think, nonetheless marked, again, an important correction to German post-war jurisprudence. After decades of legal missteps, the court in Munich concluded that when it comes to state-sponsored atrocity, guilt follows function. And that was the simple and I think the great insight of the Demjanjuk conviction. Now, armed with this admittedly highly belated new precedent, German prosecutors and investigators began reopening their files and searching for SS men whom the old flawed theory, the old flawed prosecutorial approach, had basically shielded from their day in court. And this search has led to the conviction of Oskar Grönig. Some of you might know that name. This was the so-called bookkeeper of Auschwitz. To another former SS guard named Reinhold Hanig. And for those of you who follow the news, you might know that the 96-year-old Irmgard Fürchner, the so-called Secretary of Death, or stenographer of death, is presently on trial in Germany. So a full 75 years, 3/4 of a century after the start of the Nuremberg trial, the effort to hold perpetrators and collaborators in the Holocaust continues. Now, I think we can agree that compared to the high-profile functionaries tried at Nuremberg, or the logistical mastermind Eichmann, a Demjanjuk, a Grönig, a Hanig, these are admittedly small fish, and some may question the wisdom of trying persons nearly 100 years old who had minor roles in the larger sweep of Nazi atrocity. Yet these trials, I think, remind us of a crucial truth, and that is that state-sponsored atrocity is not simply the work of statesmen like those tried at Nuremberg. It's a vast project that requires the participation of thousands, even tens of thousands of persons, from leaders of the state to lowly foot soldiers of extermination. And in this way, the present trials, I think, actually helpfully connect the dots from the high functionaries at Nuremberg to the lowly but essential operatives like Demjanjuk. And finally, I suppose these trials play a symbolic role, for at least for the moment, they keep alive the memory of the most spectacular episode of state-sponsored extermination in history. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions that you might have. And don't be shy, don't be like the students I have. Don't be shy about asking questions. I see a hand up. Oh, I'm sorry. I think we're waiting. There's a mic circulating, and so I think everyone will be able to hear you once we. And I see two separate people making.
Can you hear me? Oh,
yes, absolutely, for sure.
So kind of going back to the Eichmann trial, you showed the picture of the woman who was listening to the testimony. Were the general public allowed at any of these trials?
Yeah, so the Eichmann trial, it's kind of interesting. The Eichmann trial was actually staged in a public theater that was retrofitted as a courtroom. And there were spectators that were permitted to attend. I mean, obviously there was a large number, there was a large contingent of press, but then there were also tickets that were made available to the public for the purposes of attending the trial. And if you think about something like the Demjanjuk trial, it's very interesting to see how these trials often follow their own waves of attention and then kind of waves of inattention. When I was at the Demyanjuk trial on the very first day, there were basically lines going around the block of people trying to get into the trial, and none of these everyday spectators were admitted in. It was exclusively journalists who had the opportunity to enter the courtroom. But in the days thereafter, there were like school teachers brought their pupils in to watch parts of the trial. So we should bear in mind that these trials, from their very conception, they were really meant to perform a kind of pedagogic function as well. That is, the prosecutors consciously sought to use the trials as vehicles for teaching history and teaching history lessons. And in the case of the Eichmann trial, yes, there were laypersons who were permitted in as spectators. I see another hand over here.
Is it possible to tell us a little bit about the German prosecutors who came up with this brilliant idea of using historians to, make this argument?
Yes, for sure. In fact, so the names of the Germans who actually came up with this was a prosecutor named Kirsten Goetze and another named Thomas Walter. And they basically had kind of developed this theory for getting around these obstacles that had disabled these earlier German prosecutions. Interestingly, though, even in some of the German prosecutions that had resulted in very problematic acquittals, you had courts gesturing towards the understanding that was finally framed at Demjanjuk. You find going all the way back to 1966, there was a trial actually involving also Sobibor functionaries, in which the court wrote, what makes these people guilty is their functional participation in a death process. And so you can find these kind of antecedents to the understanding that was finally brought to bear in the Demjanjuk trial. Unfortunately, they never really bore fruit. And so in some sense, what we saw in Demjanjuk was less of an entirely novel understanding as a revival of certain little traces of doctrine that had been dropped by courts over the years and finally made into a package that really was able to carry the day.
What happened to Rosen, the people who identified in person Demjanjuk?
Yeah, so many of those, there's a pretty interesting Netflix documentary called The Devil Next Door that you might want to watch. And this documentary has interviews with some of the Treblinka survivors who were incredibly embittered as a result of the acquittal of Demjanjuk. And they continue to insist that Demjanjuk was Ivan the Terrible, was this Ivan Grozny of Treblinka.